We're going to be reading from Mark chapter 9 today. So I invite you, if you have a Bible or if you want to turn in a pew Bible to Mark chapter 9, we'll be reading verses 2 through 29. Hear the word of the Lord this morning. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone on earth could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, and one for Moses, and another for Elijah." And then the gospel writer tells us he didn't know what to say because they were frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" Jesus asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashing his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I put up with you? How long shall I stay with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity and help us." "If you can?" Jesus asked. "Everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed the boy violently, and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And Jesus replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? Prepare our hearts, O God, to accept your word. Silence in us any voice but your own, that hearing we may also obey your will. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this story is the story of the Transfiguration. And it's the story of something that happens on a mountain. Actually, we read 2 stories. We read the story of the Transfiguration, which happens on a mountain. And then we read the story of the healing of the boy, which happens in a valley. And the reason we read both is because that's what we want to talk about today, mountains and valleys. The transfiguration of Jesus on that mountain was an event that the church deemed so special, so significant, that historically the church has had a day on the calendar year, a special Sunday, just to commemorate that event, like the baptism of the Lord, like Advent and Christmas, like Palm Sunday, which incidentally, I must tell you, we've been reading through the Gospel of Mark, and we're on our way to Easter, the resurrection. But Palm Sunday would normally be the Sunday before Easter. Well, this year for us, Palm Sunday is going to be next Sunday. Because the Sunday between Palm Sunday and Easter, we're going to be looking at the Passion and the Crucifixion found in Mark 14 and 15. So next week we'll be in Mark 11, and we'll see Jesus enter the holy city of Jerusalem. But normally the Transfiguration would have been February 14th. And we had a lot of other things going on that day. So for Robertsdale, today is Transfiguration Sunday. And we have as our backdrop all 8 chapters leading up to this event where we've been journeying with Jesus. And what I see in the story today is that if we choose to journey with Jesus, we will experience times on the mountain and times in the valley. And as I hear this story of what Peter, James, and John got to experience like nothing ever before, I'm reminded of 4 questions that I just recently learned from a modern-day philosopher who lives in Montana. And I want you to think about the answer to these 4 questions or statements as I declare them. When is the last time you were ever able to say, "There is no place I'd rather be"? There's no one I'd rather be with. There's nothing I'd rather be doing. And this I will remember well. When's the last time you were able to answer those 4 questions? Because if you were able to say all 4, then chances are you've experienced what life on the mountain is like. If you have not been able to say all 4 of those, or maybe you can't say all of them today, maybe it's a sign that you're living life to some degree in the valley. Or maybe you're somewhere in between. Maybe you're with the people or person you would want to be with, but you'd rather be somewhere else. When's the last time you were able to say all 4? There's nothing I'd rather be doing. There's no place I'd rather be. There's no one I'd rather be with. And this I will remember well. In this text this morning, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up onto a mountain. And Peter is the first to blurt something out. And what fascinates me about what he says is that his reaction seems very natural, but then the gospel writer tells us that the only reason he says this is because he's actually afraid and doesn't know what to say. Have you ever said something in a significant moment because you don't know what to say? But it seems like something should be said, so you just blurt out whatever's on your mind and heart. And what Peter blurts out is, "Lord, it's really good for us to be here. Let's stay." And then he suggests that he builds shelters for Jesus and Moses, and almost as if he expects the spirit of Moses and Elijah to hang around a while, like they don't have anything better to do. And that word for shelters is actually the same word for booths, which the Jews had a festival of booths. It's also the same word for tabernacle. Festival of Booths is also known as the Festival of Tabernacles. And what that signals to us, one scholar that I read actually suggested that Peter is trying to say, we need to establish a new Jewish festival. Something so special is happening that when the presence of God shows up in this kind of way, you commemorate it and you remember it forever. I know the temple is over there, but where the Spirit of the Lord is, you're supposed to have some kind of tabernacle. So let's build them. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. You know, these 3 guys are all mountaineers, if you think about it. These are all men that we would remember spending time on a mountain. Jesus was not encountering his first mountain in this story, was he? Jesus went away frequently and found a mountain or a mountainside, didn't he? In fact, one of his favorite spots was the Mount of Olives. And Jesus would often steal away up onto the mountain to be alone with the Father and spend time in prayer. In fact, that's where Jesus was, alone on the mountainside, when he saw the disciples in the boat on the lake straining at the oars, and he went out to them, walking on the water, just a few chapters before in Mark. Boy, that comforts me, knowing that the God who is spending time on the mountain would go to where he sees his children struggling and would meet us there to help. Jesus in Matthew's gospel went up on top of a mountain and he began to teach. And his teaching was so powerful and so memorable that it's known today as the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. And what about Moses? Did Moses have any experience with mountains? Yeah. What happened with Moses on a mountain? The Ten Commandments, right? The giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And do you remember how God showed up on that mountain? He showed up in a cloud. And he thundered from the cloud as he gave the law to Moses to give to the Israelites. And the children of God at the base of the mountain were so terrified because all the way from below they could see the terror of God's presence in the cloud. And here we see a cloud again, don't we? And a voice thundering from that cloud. And no one has to ask whose voice it is because it sounds the same as the voice at Jesus' baptism that spoke over him, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And today he's adding, "Listen to him." Peter's the first one to speak, and that's interesting to me because just a few chapters ago, it seems like Peter's already been up on a mountain and already been back in a valley, and now he's back up on another mountain. Figuratively speaking, he was on a mountain, actually, literally. Jesus was taking them through a mountain range when they were away from the crowds, and Peter said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered on behalf of all the disciples, and you remember what he said? He said, "You are the Christ." This was the first declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. And yet, just a few verses later, Peter can't even wrap his mind around Jesus saying he has to suffer and die and then be raised again. And Jesus rebukes him to the point of calling him Satan and says, "You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but the concerns of man." Now Peter's back on the mountain. It's good for us to be here. We should build shelters. We should stay. Then there's Elijah. Elijah, the great prophet. Did he have any experience with mountains? Oh, yes. One mountain in particular I remember is called Mount Carmel, where he had a showdown with 400 prophets of Baal. And after taunting the prophets of Baal because he wouldn't show up, after years of drought, he asks them to pour water all over his offering. And he prays, and God comes down in the form of a pillar of fire and consumes the entire offering and licks up all the water that Elijah said to put in the trench around the offering. Licks it bone dry. In fact, I haven't read of a single mountain in the Bible, Old Testament or New, that was just mentioned incidentally. If you see a mountain, you look for glory, because it's always sure to follow. You remember where the ark landed after the flood? Mount Ararat, right? It landed on the top of a mountain. The mountain is the place historically, and Jesus and those in his Jewish tradition knew this at the time, which was the meeting place between God and man. So naturally, Peter would want to stay. But as Jesus is transfigured before him, I want to make clear that what Mark is not showing us yet is that Jesus is God. Now, Mark and his readers believe that, so do we, and he's going to show that. But it's too easy for us to skip ahead to that point, to say that this story is all about revealing that Jesus really is God. Well, the story is actually not revealing yet that Jesus is God. It is confirming what Peter already declared, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the chosen one of God. As I picture this story, I always picture a triangle, because 3 points always make a triangle, right? And when 3 persons are standing near each other, regardless of where they're standing, they make a triangle. Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. Moses representing the law. Elijah representing the prophets, the most famous of the Old Testament prophets. That is, until John the Baptist, who technically is the last Old Testament prophet. But Moses and Elijah are there, and I always picture them pointing to Jesus. Their two sides of the triangle being a huge billboard. And this is what I think we're meant to see. That the law and the prophets always pointed to this one. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. Just as you've listened to the law, just as you've listened to the prophets, listen to him. Peter wants to commemorate this God-like never-before event on the mountain with these three mountaineers, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. Do you think if we could ask Peter, James, and John, is there any place you'd rather be? Clearly they'd say no. In fact, Peter wanted to stay. Is there anyone you'd rather be with? Are you kidding? Jesus, who we're just finding out as the Messiah after following him all this time, seeing all he's done, learning that he's the one that we've been waiting on. We were always told Elijah had to come first. And we're still so curious about that after seeing Elijah that we're going to ask Jesus about it on the way down the mountain. There's no one I'd rather be with. There is nothing I'd rather be doing. And you can better believe we will remember this well. In fact, we'll remember it so well that Matthew's going to write it down, Luke's going to write it down, and Mark's going to write it down. And unlike some other stories, the details of this one are hardly different at all. They all wanted to get it just like this, and they remembered it so well that here we are in 2021 in Robertsdale, Alabama, still talking about it. Because it was so special. They met God on the mountain. It is good for us to be here. But Jesus knows they can't stay there. Peter doesn't yet, but Jesus does. Because Jesus knows that while it's good to be on the mountain, it's good to be here, you have to go there. You have to go back down into the valley because that's where the revelation given on the mountain is needed. And so that's where Jesus goes. And if we follow him, that's where we go to. The mountain is the place we stay, that we say it is good for us to be here. The valley is the place where we say, I believe, help my unbelief. I love that Father. He's one of my heroes of the Bible. I relate to him a lot better than I relate to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I relate to him a lot better than I relate to King David or even Moses, the reluctant, stuttering leader who was stubborn. I relate to this Father because his story seems so small, and yet he's quickly thrust in front of Jesus, and it's his faith that drives him there. And yet he's so honest and so authentic to say, I do believe, but help my unbelief. I think this is one of my life verses. And because he has faith at all, and he's honest about needing more, Jesus does what his disciples could not do. The mountain is what C.S. Lewis calls a thin place. You understand that language? It's a place where the veil between heaven and earth just seems a little thinner. Where God's presence is a little more obvious when it's otherwise overlooked. Valleys are the thick places, and we need in the valley the assurance and memory of what we learned on the mountain. When I was growing up in junior and senior high, there was a Christian summer camp that became a thin place for me. I encountered God in special ways there. And the stories that I would have of just that brief time at that camp would carry me through all year. I would tell them throughout the year while I was in the thick places until I was able to go back again to that thin place. It wasn't that God wasn't with me all throughout the rest of the year. It's just that he seemed a little more accessible there. And that fueled my faith in times when he didn't seem so accessible. But this is part of the journey with Jesus, right? Mountains and valleys. Can you think of some thin places in your life? Has 22220 Highway 59 ever been a thin place for you? Where God's presence was a little more obvious, where he seemed a little more accessible? I would argue that whenever we have shared the waters of baptism and the elements of communion, even as we did last Sunday, that the place becomes a lot thinner as channels of grace open and we experience the wonder and the beauty of the presence with God among the children of God. I wonder where you are today. If you feel like you're on a mountain, if you feel like you're in a valley, or if you're somewhere in between, maybe on your way up or down. My prayer is that if this is not a mountain right now for you, that it will be before you leave, or even if you're not all the way there when you leave, that as you go about the rest of your day and you go home, that your home would also just be a continuation of the sanctuary as you meditate on the Lord today and worship Him, and that you would feel close to Him in a way that you know He goes with you into the rest of your week. This is life with Jesus, mountains and valleys. But as I think about that this week, and I think this is what the text is telling us, I run into a problem. And the problem is, I remember how Mark begins his gospel and introduces John the Baptist. Do you remember what he says? He actually quotes Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 40 verse 3. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for Him. And so John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And when I go to Isaiah 40 and think, I think it says more than that. It does. When I read verses 3 through 5, the full passage says, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places will become smooth. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Here's why that presents a problem for me. I read in this text that life with Jesus involves mountains and valleys, right? And that if we follow Him, we're going to experience mountains and valleys. And then I think about my own experience in the Christian life and the experience of the church and others that I do life with. And it all seems to match up, that we go through mountains and valleys. That's to be expected. But this seems to suggest that in preparation for the coming of the Lord, the ground will be equalized. The low places will be raised up. The high places will be brought down. The rough places will be made smooth. Am I not to read that it'll just be smooth sailing with Jesus? Well, some people say, well, Pastor, you got to realize He's coming again. And it's going to be rough, right? Until He comes back. And I think, okay, well, maybe Isaiah's talking about the second coming. But no, I don't think so, because John the Baptist is the one he's talking about, right? Mark tells us that. John the Baptist was that voice of the one calling. And who is he saying to prepare the way for? Jesus. John said, this is the guy. What Isaiah said would happen is now happening. I have prepared the way, and here He is. And I think, how does that reconcile? Well, wait a minute, that's exactly how it reconciles. The God of the mountain has just shown up in the valley. The God of the temple has shown up in the wilderness. The God who is on high and above all has made Himself low, and here He is. And when we walk with Him, He takes us up the mountain, and He is there with us. And yet He leads us right back down in the valley, and He is no less there. God is bringing the low places up and the high places down in Jesus. This is what He's doing. He's going down into the valley, and finally the God on the mountain is bringing glory into places of suffering. And we're going to need to remember that. Peter, James, and John are going to need to remember the glory that was revealed on the mountain, because Jesus is going to be approaching more and more a place of suffering that is going to be to the shock and horror of those closest to Him. We're going to need to remember the mountain when we go with Jesus into the valley. But this is exactly what God is doing in His Son. This is the incarnation. This is the transfiguration. This is the crucifixion. This is the resurrection. This is the gospel, the good news, that the God of the mountain has come into the valley. You know, it occurs to me that when Jesus goes up onto the mountain, he is no more with the Father there than he is in the valley. That's why even when his disciples couldn't cast out that impure spirit, he could. It's not as if he had the less power to do that than he did when he was on the mountain. The revelation is taken into the valley to bring glory to suffering, wholeness to the broken and even demonic, healing into the sick, and salvation to all who would believe. It is good for us to be here. Amen. But we have to go there. And he is no less with us there than he is here. He shows us himself on the mountain that we might recognize him in the valley. So my prayer is that we would recognize him here in this thin place, that we might leave and even recognize him there, wherever there is, wherever we will go this week, that we will be aware of his presence, not just when it's obvious, but when it's also overlooked, that we would realize the God of the mountain has come